Yeah, it was probably one of the most emotional and draining verdicts I've ever sat through. 2 hours the judge took to explain.
A 10-year-old boy named Anthony Avalos says goodnight to his family in his Lancaster, California home. The next morning, a 911 call shatters the silence. But the story his mother tells makes no sense. How could a system designed to protect him fail so completely? But this isn't just the story of a single night. To understand what really happened to Anthony, we have to go back years, through the countless warnings that were ignored time and time again. Our story begins on May 4th, 2008, in the quiet community of Palmdale, California. That day marked the arrival of a little boy named Anthony Nolan Avalos, a bright, curious child who would come to mean everything to those around him. His parents, Victor and Heather Barron, were barely out of their teenage, still finding their way in life, when they suddenly had a new life depending on them. It was a moment filled with both hope and uncertainty, a time when dreams of family and stability seemed within reach, even if the path ahead was far from clear. Not long after Anthony's birth, circumstances began to pull the young family apart. Victor, who was originally from Mexico, was required to return to his home country. Despite his efforts to stay connected, through phone calls, video chats, and promises of visits, distance has a way of fading even the strongest intentions. Those early conversations eventually became less frequent until, quietly, they stopped altogether. Anthony's father missed many of his son's first moments, the kind every parent longs to see, but sometimes must accept only through stories and photographs. Meanwhile, Heather was left to navigate motherhood on her own. Still very young and without a stable support system, she faced challenges that would overwhelm almost anyone in her position. Over the next few years, her relationships shifted often, and with each new beginning came new responsibilities. By her early 20s, she was the mother of 7 children, a reality that would weigh heavily on her shoulders. The demands of caring for so many little ones, often with limited help, began to take a toll. To keep her family afloat, Heather worked long hours at a neighborhood sandwich shop, relying on a small paycheck and government assistance to get by. Even so, the days were long, and the pressure rarely eased. Those who knew her described her as tense, often tired, and visibly worn by the stress of trying to manage so much on her own. She herself admitted that the constant struggle left her drained, explaining that she did the best she could with the limited tools and energy she had. It's never simple to understand how a person can love their children and yet act in ways that bring them harm. Heather's life at this point seemed to exist in a painful contradiction. She was a mother stretched thin, emotionally, financially, and spiritually. The exhaustion of raising 7 children alone would break almost anyone. And yet, despite her constant worry about money and stability, she continued to bring new life into a world that already felt overwhelming. It wasn't logic that guided her choices. It was something far deeper, a quiet yearning for connection, for permanence, for someone who might finally stay. Each new relationship carried a fragile hope that maybe this time things would be different. But as one partner after another drifted away, her disappointment seemed to shift inward, yet also outward, landing unfairly on the children who looked to her for care and comfort. But before we begin, I just want to say thank you to my amazing viewers and subscribers. Your support through likes, shares, and comments means the world to me. Your engagement helps me make these stories even more meaningful. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Money remained the family's constant struggle. Heather's minimum wage job barely covered the basics, and she had no means to afford professional childcare. So, like many single parents trying to keep their heads above water, she turned to family for help. Her father often watched the children, and for a while, it seemed like a necessary arrangement. Family helping family. But in 2012, that trust would be shaken in a way that altered the course of young Anthony's life. A relative, concerned by what they had seen, contacted Child Protective Services to report that something was deeply wrong. What should have been a safe space had instead become a source of alarm. Anthony was only 4 years old when his case first came to the attention of the Department of Children and Family Services, known as DCFS. Investigators looked into the concerns and tragically confirmed that the situation was not what it should have been. The findings pointed to troubling behavior from Heather's father, behavior that should never have occurred around a child. Yet the official response felt heartbreakingly insufficient. No charges were brought forward, and no deeper inquiry followed. Instead, Heather was advised to keep Anthony away from her father and to seek counseling for her son. She assured caseworkers that she would do both, and with that promise, the file was closed. But promises, as it turned out, were easier to make than to keep. Reports later suggested that Heather continued to rely on her father for childcare, despite everything that had been uncovered. The recommended therapy sessions for Anthony never took place. Caseworkers did not follow up. The file remained closed, and the oversight that should have protected him simply vanished. As Anthony grew older, his began to show in quiet but unmistakable ways. Teachers and classmates noticed his struggles, moments of frustration, sudden outbursts, and long stretches of silence that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. To many, his behavior looked like a child acting out, but beneath it all, it was the quiet plea of someone yearning to be seen and understood. His challenges at school weren't about disobedience. They were reflections of a little boy trying to make sense of a world that hadn't given him the safety every child deserves. By 2014, the concern within the family reached a breaking point. Anthony's aunt, Crystal, confided in her therapist about troubling things she had witnessed when visiting Heather's home. Bound by law to report such concerns, the therapist contacted Child Protective Services, prompting another review by the Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS. This time, Anthony was 6 years old enough to speak for himself, to share what life had been like in his own words. What emerged during the visits painted a deeply concerning picture. Social workers observed the household and found conditions that reflected strain, exhaustion, and a clear lack of stability. Heather, visibly overwhelmed, admitted she was struggling to cope with the growing demands of raising her children alone. Yet despite the evidence and Heather's own acknowledgement that she needed help, the official response was startlingly mild. Instead of removing the children from what was clearly an unsafe and unstable home, DCFS enrolled her in a voluntary family maintenance program, a plan typically reserved for families facing minor challenges rather than documented patterns of neglect or risk. The decision would later be questioned by multiple experts, who argued that this case should have been treated with far greater urgency. After all, the agency already knew Heather had failed to follow through on past recommendations. It was as if history was quietly repeating itself, only this time with even higher stakes. This brings us to one of the most difficult questions in Anthony's story. How did a situation with such visible warning signs get classified as low risk? To understand that, we have to look at how the system itself was designed to function. At the time, Los Angeles County's DCFS had implemented a computerized tool meant to help social workers assess danger more objectively. The idea was that data, free of bias or emotion, would guide better decisions. Workers would enter case details, observations, and reports, and the program would calculate a risk score. In theory, high scores would trigger stronger interventions, such as emergency removal, mandatory counseling, or supervised check-ins. It was meant to be a safeguard, a digital voice that could catch what human fatigue or case overload might miss. But in Anthony's case, that safety net didn't work as intended. The numbers and metrics that should have raised alarms somehow failed to prompt real action. And while algorithms can process information, they can't feel compassion or urgency. They can't hear a child's tone of voice or sense the quiet desperation behind their words. That, perhaps, is where the system failed most, not just in its data, but in its humanity. Even the most advanced system can only be as effective as the people behind it. In Anthony's case, that human element, the very thing meant to bring compassion and discernment, became the weakest point in the chain. Testimonies later revealed that some social workers disregarded the warning signs flagged by their own tools. The reasons, though never fully clear, seemed rooted in exhaustion and bureaucratic pressure. Classifying a case as high risk meant hours of documentation, follow-ups, and court involvement. Labeling it low risk, on the other hand, meant less work and fewer immediate demands. Somewhere in that gap between convenience and responsibility, Anthony's reality was quietly minimized. The manager overseeing the case, Mark Millman, approved the decision to keep Heather in the voluntary program, one far too light for the gravity of her family's situation. It didn't take long for professionals within that program to realize something was seriously wrong. One of the first counselors assigned to Heather's case described her as deeply overwhelmed, struggling to manage her emotions and the constant demands of parenting. His reports noted that she often appeared short-tempered and detached, even during supervised sessions. In his view, she lacked insight into her own challenges and was unable to meet the children's emotional needs. Despite these findings, Heather began skipping appointments and distancing herself from the very services designed to help her. When questioned, she agreed to transition into a different support plan, in-home counseling provided by the Antelope Valley Children's Center. But when counselors from this organization entered Heather's home, they found the situation even more concerning. The atmosphere was tense and unpredictable, and their visits often ended with feelings of unease. The children seemed fearful, and Heather's reactions toward them were marked by visible frustration. While she occasionally acknowledged her struggles, her efforts to change never took hold. Counselors later shared that they left the home worried, not just for the children's safety, but for their emotional well-being. Several professionals reported that they personally felt unsafe during visits, which underscored how volatile the environment had become. Repeatedly, these concerns were sent up the chain of command, but communication stalled. Counselors said that reaching Mark Millman, the supervisor responsible for the case, was nearly impossible. When they did manage to contact him, their warnings were brushed aside or minimized. The sense of urgency they felt never seemed to translate into real action. In growing desperation, one counselor bypassed the usual channels altogether, calling the Child Protection Hotline directly to demand intervention. She wasn't alone in her alarm. Other staff members at the center also contacted the hotline after witnessing Heather's behavior during on-site visits. Even in the presence of professionals, Heather's actions toward her children revealed a concerning lack of restraint. To see such disregard for boundaries in a controlled environment was deeply troubling. It suggested that she no longer feared consequences. Whether intentionally or not, the system had taught her that no matter how far things went, real accountability would never come. And when a parent begins to believe that no one will intervene, the warning signs quietly multiply. When counselors and staff at the center tried to help Heather understand how her reactions were affecting the children, she didn't argue. She nodded, admitted it was wrong, but then shifted responsibility entirely onto the children, saying they were the ones who provoked her. The staff noticed something deeply unsettling. They couldn't recall a single affectionate word from her about any of her children. In her own words, she sometimes became rough because they were mischievous. To the professionals observing her, Heather seemed detached, unable to express care or warmth. Some even wondered if her behavior was a desperate plea for help, a way to signal that she couldn't handle motherhood anymore and wanted someone to intervene. But what later came to light revealed something far colder. In conversations with family members, Heather admitted she feared losing her children not out of love, but because she would lose the financial assistance that came with caring for them. To her, the children seemed less like a family and more like the foundation of her livelihood.
As the household grew with the birth of her fifth child, Heather's patience wore thinner. One counselor from Antelope Valley Children's Center, alarmed by the worsening situation, made repeated calls to their supervisor, Mark Millman, desperate to have someone take action. When she finally reached him, his response left her stunned. He said, "I'm aware of the case and I believe Heather is doing her best. There's no need for an alarm." The staff were speechless. They had witnessed distressing signs, raised countless warnings, and yet their words carried no weight. Feeling powerless, they made a difficult choice. They called the emergency hotline once again. This time, they weren't just reporting Heather's conduct. They were reporting the very department responsible for protecting the children, but the system turned out to be a maze. The hotline they contacted was overseen by the same regional office of DCFS that employed Mark Millman. Soon after that call, instead of launching an internal review, Millman made an unexpected decision. He withdrew the Antelope Valley team from the case altogether and reassigned it to another agency, Hathaway Sycamore's Child and Family Services. The professionals at Antelope Valley were heartbroken. They feared the children had just lost an important layer of support. At the new agency, the family was assigned a counselor named Barbara Dixon, a child psychologist who approached the situation with a fresh perspective, but with little knowledge of the family's troubling history. Heather quickly took advantage of that clean slate. She portrayed her eldest son, Anthony, as the main problem, restless, difficult, and in need of discipline. Barbara accepted Heather's version of events and set simple behavioral goals for Anthony, never realizing the depth of what he had been through. The earlier concerns, hotline calls, and detailed reports from the previous center were never reviewed. Soon after, Mark Millman officially closed the DCFS case, noting that Heather had met the program's basic requirements and was open to support. Around that same time, in 2015, Heather's brother introduced her to one of his co-workers, a man named 𝐂𝐫𝐜𝐿𝐵. At first, he appeared kind and easygoing, and for a brief moment, Heather's family hoped things might improve. But within months, new and serious concerns arose. A relative reported a troubling incident to the sheriff's department, and a deputy filed a report. Yet no follow-up investigation ever took place. DCFS received a copy of that report as well, but once again, there was no contact made with Kareem, no background check, and no home visit. Had anyone looked more closely, they would have found that Kareem had multiple restraining orders filed against him and known ties to a street group in California. These red flags should have prompted immediate review, but instead a new case file was quietly opened. Oddly, only for Heather's youngest child, not for Anthony or his siblings. The newly assigned specialist, Anna Chiatino, later revealed she had contacted the hotline simply to ensure that her call log reflected compliance, to cover their bases, as she put it. By then, Anthony's life had become defined by missed opportunities for help, each warning diluted, each report left unanswered. The people who saw the signs had tried to speak up. The system that was supposed to protect him heard everything, and yet somehow acted on nothing. When social worker Anna Shortino was assigned to the family's case, her focus was primarily on Anthony's younger brother, Angel. At the time, she didn't review the prior documentation, 5 separate reports that had previously raised concerns. During a scheduled family visit in 2015, she made a call to the hotline as required by policy, but later admitted that she didn't believe there was enough evidence to substantiate the father's allegations. In her testimony years later, she shared that her decision to call was largely procedural, a way to ensure she had followed the rules. Anna noted that the children repeated the same explanation for their concerning marks, saying in the shower. She accepted that explanation at face value and concluded that the father's claims didn't hold weight. It seemed like the case would close quietly. But then, in an unexpected turn, an automated assessment tool flagged the situation as high risk. For the first time, the system, not a person, recognized the danger. Following protocol, Anna referred the matter to law enforcement for further review. It should have been the beginning of meaningful action. Unfortunately, the report landed with an officer who had a reputation for dismissing child welfare referrals. Rather than conducting a full investigation, he approved the report without follow-up, effectively ending the inquiry. Another chance to protect Anthony slipped through the cracks. Feeling betrayed and helpless, Anthony's father decided to take matters into his own hands. He refused to return his son to Heather's care, which led to rising tension between the families. Heather's brother, David, stepped in, offering temporary refuge for the children while things settled. For the first time in a long while, Anthony and his siblings felt safe. At Lincoln Elementary School, teachers had already noticed troubling patterns and were familiar with DCFS involvement. One afternoon, Anthony confided in the school's vice principal, 𝐂𝐫𝐜𝐬, sharing that home did not feel like a safe place and that basic needs were often unmet. Disturbed by his words, 𝐂𝐫𝐬𝐬 immediately called the Child Protection Hotline once again. While staying with their uncle David, the children began to open up further. Away from the fear that shadowed them at home, they described situations that reflected deep emotional distress. They pleaded with their aunt and uncle not to send them back, saying they didn't feel protected there. David and his wife were heartbroken by what they heard. They too contacted the hotline, reporting their concerns. When Heather later arrived to retrieve the children, David refused to let them go. The situation escalated, and law enforcement was called to the scene. The responding officer later testified that the children's fear was evident. He reviewed photographs and listened to their accounts before concluding that it would be unsafe to return them to Heather and her partner. His official recommendation was clear: the children should remain under the care of relatives. For a brief moment, it seemed like the system might finally do the right thing. Reports were filed, agencies were notified, and multiple voices echoed the same plea: to protect the children. When DCFS arrived to conduct a new investigation, Anthony seemed hopeful. Surrounded by people who showed him kindness, he began to imagine a different life, one where safety and love were constants, not exceptions. He told his relatives that he wanted to stay, that he finally felt like he belonged. In his young words, he said Heather felt like someone from the past, while this new home felt like the beginning of something better. Sadly, that fragile hope would soon be tested again by the same system that had failed to keep him safe time and time before. When the case reached the local DCFS office again, a worker reached out to Barbara Dixon, the counselor who had previously worked closely with Heather and her children. What came next was devastating. Barbara claimed that no one at her center had received any concerning reports. With that statement, the children were ordered to return home to Heather and her partner, Kareem. Despite consistent warnings from Anthony himself, his uncle, a school administrator, and even a responding police officer, the system once again decided there was nothing to worry about. When a social worker later met Anthony at school, he quietly said the words adults seemed to expect, that things were better now. A few weeks later, he and his brother told another worker that they had exaggerated everything, that life at home was fine. To anyone looking closely, it should have been clear that something was deeply wrong, that the children were afraid to tell the truth. But instead of recognizing the fear behind their words, the case was officially closed. The file stated that the home was stable, and the family was left without support.
Once the oversight ended, the situation inside the home grew even more unstable. Barbara Dixon withdrew her services entirely, believing her role was no longer needed. Heather's relationship with Kareem continued to spiral between brief reconciliations and tense separations. She confided in relatives that she feared his lifestyle and the people he associated with, yet she kept letting him back in. Still, those close to the family knew the turmoil had started long before Kareem appeared. By 2016, one final report reached DCFS from a service provider who described witnessing troubling conditions inside the home. She even mentioned concerns about the children's safety and overall well-being. But when investigators came to interview the family, the children once again denied everything. They said they were fine, that they had made up earlier stories, even claiming they didn't know Kareem. It was painfully obvious they were too scared to speak freely, but that truth was lost amid paperwork and procedure. DCFS marked the case unsubstantiated. The sheriff's office, which received the same report, chose not to investigate either. By the end of that year, every official door that could have offered protection had quietly closed. Cut off from relatives who had tried to intervene, Heather isolated the children even more. Family members would later say they occasionally spotted the kids outside but were told not to approach them. Heather changed schools and kept their history secret, trying to erase all connections to the past. Yet, despite everything, Anthony remained a gentle, thoughtful child. His new teachers described him as attentive, curious, and far wiser than his years. One of them, Harmony Bell, saw something special in him: his determination to learn, his kindness toward classmates, and his quiet gratitude for even small moments of encouragement. School became his only refuge. To him, Miss Bell's classroom wasn't just a place to study. It was the one environment where he felt seen and valued. On the last day of the school year, Anthony handed Miss Bell a letter that revealed just how much her kindness had meant. He thanked her for believing in him, calling her one of the best teachers he'd ever had. He wrote that he wished she could be there for all his school years, middle school, high school, even college, so they could keep seeing each other as he grew. He ended the letter by saying he knew he would have a good life, signing it, "Your friend, Anthony Avalos." Reading those words now, it's impossible not to feel both heartbreak and admiration for the depth of love and hope that lived inside this child, even after so much disappointment. Anthony's letter became a lasting symbol of resilience, the quiet strength of a child who, despite everything, still believed in goodness. But his story also became a haunting reminder of how systems can fail the very people they are meant to protect. Not long after that school year ended, Anthony's world changed once again. Without the safety of school, or the watchful eyes of caring adults, he was left alone in an environment that had already proven unsafe. In June 2018, according to later testimony, a series of troubling events began unfolding inside the home. On the morning of June 19th, Heather told investigators that Anthony seemed unwell and asked to rest. When she checked on him later, he was unresponsive. Emergency services were called immediately, but it was too late. In June of 2018, Heather Barron later told investigators that a particular event had set everything in motion. Whether that account was true, or a way to explain what happened after, remains uncertain. Over the next several days, those living in the home described growing tension and emotional strain. By June 19th, Heather said that Anthony had told her he wasn't feeling well. She claimed she considered taking him to the hospital, but he asked to rest instead. When she checked on him later, she noticed something wasn't right. The next morning, Heather's daughter recalled her brother appearing deeply unwell. After several attempts to help, emergency services were called. When paramedics arrived, Anthony was taken to the hospital. Medical professionals expressed concern over his condition. One doctor later testified that the first question that came to mind wasn't, "What happened?" but how the situation had gone unnoticed for so long. Heather calmly explained that her son had fallen, a version of events she repeated many times, even as questions arose about what truly happened. Her account would soon become one of the key debates in court. As doctors worked urgently to stabilize Anthony, his relatives arrived at the hospital. Among them were his uncle David and his wife, who had long tried to protect the children through calls to authorities. Even in that moment, Heather's focus appeared divided between her family's concern and her own frustration over their involvement. She reportedly demanded apologies before allowing them into the room. The next morning, June 21st, came the news no one wanted to hear. Anthony had not survived. His uncle was by his side until the very end. Only after his passing did the system finally take immediate action. The other children in the home were placed into protective custody, and once they felt safe, they began to open up about what life had been like. They shared memories of an environment marked by instability and fear, where Anthony had often tried to protect the younger ones. Their statements became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Still, when sentencing time came, politics shaped the outcome. The newly elected district attorney had previously declared that the penalty would not be pursued in any case. For Heather and Kareem, that meant the maximum possible punishment was life in prison, a decision that deeply frustrated Anthony's relatives, who felt it did not reflect the gravity of what had happened. Tragically, this was not the first time. Los Angeles County's child welfare system had faced such questions. Over several weeks, prosecutors outlined what they described as years of neglect and missed opportunities by the system. Recordings of Heather's interviews were played in court, where she maintained that she had never harmed her. Witnesses, including Anthony's Aunt Maria, testified that Heather had resisted family help out of fear of losing financial support. In a separate legal action, Anthony's relatives filed a civil lawsuit against social services, citing failures consistent with the earlier cases of Gabriel Fernandez and Noah Quattro. That lawsuit ended in a settlement worth $32 million. March 7, 2023, the judge announced his decision. Heather Barron and Kareem Leva were found guilty on all major counts. Anthony Avalos' story is not just about one family. It's a reflection of how systems designed to protect children can sometimes fall short. It's easy to point fingers, but the truth runs deeper. Limited resources, overwhelming caseloads, and systemic issues all played a role. Still, none of that justifies the missed opportunities to step in sooner. Anthony's life should have been filled with warmth, laughter, and possibility. Instead, it serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and accountability. Their efforts ensured that his story continues to inspire awareness and reform. Today, there's a sense of hope. Anthony's siblings, now in caring environments, have the opportunity to heal and move forward. His story reminds us that protecting children begins not only with systems, but with compassion, attentiveness, and the courage to act when something doesn't feel right. Our role as a community is to support the people who truly care, while demanding accountability from those in power. If you ever come across a situation that doesn't feel right, speak up. Reach out. Sometimes a single call, a single question, can make all the difference. Your voice can be part of what keeps a child safe. Friends, thank you so much for staying with me through this difficult story. I hope we can all learn from it and keep working toward a future where every child grows up surrounded by care, attention, and understanding. Awareness is the first step toward change, and together, we can help make sure these stories lead to something better. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, take care of yourselves and each other, and I'll see you again very soon.